Welcome back to our channel, everyone. Today we are tackling a topic that touches many lives: harm reduction as a tool for fighting against addiction. We've got an amazing guest, Bill Wirtz. Hello, Bill, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, Bill is the senior policy analyst for the Consumer Choice Center. He focuses especially on evidence-based policy making, agricultural and trade policy, as well as lifestyle choice. Together, we will dive into what harm reduction really means, how it changes lives, and what is crucial to be implemented it in a correct way. But before we start talking about harm reduction, could you tell about yourself? What is your current role and what projects and initiatives are you implementing right now?
Yeah, well, first off, madlaba for having me. Really appreciate being on this show. My name is Bill Wirtz. I'm originally from a very small country called Luxembourg.
We beat your football.
You did, you did.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big football guy, but I think our side thinks that the referees were, of course, partial to the Georgian team.
No.
So, of course, this is how football goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, you beat us to it. Football is not our greatest strength. Maybe Eurovision this year. Who knows? Maybe we can beat you at that. But so my as you said already, I'm a senior policy analyst at Consumer Choice Center. I focus currently a lot on agriculture and chemicals policy. But what's interesting is that evidence-based policy making, it doesn't really matter where you apply it. It transcends all of these different issues, and whether you're talking about whether you should buy organic or conventional food, the same logic of how you apply knowledge also goes into the sphere of tobacco harm reduction, on which I have done a lot of work. My most recent project was called Fun Police. It's a podcast series, 2 seasons already, where I look into...
Where can we see your episodes?
Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Fun Police. It's first season had 5 episodes, and the second season has 4 episodes. It's really storytelling mode. I wanted to make something different. I mean, if you're a podcast guy, I mean, for me it was Serial, This American Life, these type of storytelling modes, where I wanted that people who were looking to find a story to listen to, would stumble upon it. In the tobacco harm reduction crowd, a lot of people, they already know everything, but I wanted to have a venue where people can listen to this for the first time. And the idea of Fun Police was to look at who wants to restrict all of these alternatives. Who are the people who want to ban alcohol? Who are the people who want to ban smoking and so on? Or gambling. Gambling is another one that we all talk about on the series as well. So that was something I've been working on recently, where I could use those creative juices to make something different. And yeah, it's a lot of fun because I get to talk about these issues and try and relay them in all sorts of media, whether it's on podcasts, radio, TV, to an audience that might be new to it. So, including on Georgian podcasts, which, how cool is that, right?
Yeah. Okay. As a representative of Consumer Choice Center, you wrote, and I will read your quote. In a nutshell, consumer choice describes the idea that consumers should be able to freely choose to buy a product or service or not to buy it, based solely on their own judgment and predicated on wants and needs they set themselves. So, as I read it, it is a very common idea, maybe. But can you tell us what makes it impossible for consumers to do that?
Yeah, so... I mean, we as consumers, we all make choices every day. Fortunately, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, so we have more than we have more than one type of bread and cereal and different types. We have brand identity. We look at the supermarket and we have a preferred retailer. We have a preferred type of milk. We have all these preferences. To some people, it's even overwhelming. For those who've ever traveled to the United States, they have so many choices. It's even hard to find sort of where to go with it. So we make choices all the time, but do we make them freely? And the interesting conversation there is the people who think that we don't make those choices freely they go at it from a perspective of we have been influenced by marketing, by our education system. And because we have been negatively influenced, the government needs to rectify that with a regulatory system. So the products you see in the supermarket, they are already regulated. Some of them make sense. You have health and safety regulations. You have the fact that what is written on the product also has to be accurate, the ingredient information. That much makes sense. But there's also regulations on how much sugar is allowed to be in there. There's taxes put on those products. And the biggest problem I identify, for instance, for everything you buy in the supermarket is that it is not clear what the real price is. Because on the one hand, you pay for food with the money you make. But on the other hand, as a taxpayer, you also subsidize agriculture. And so you don't really know what is the real price of an apple. And so it makes it hard to choose from if you lack all the information. You don't get to choose. That's one part. The other part is if things are banned, right? I was, and we'll get to vaping, I'm sure. But here in Tbilisi, just yesterday, I went to a vape shop, and I mean, I've seen it a few times in different countries, but here, the products are not visible. I have to ask for a specific product. What that does, it doesn't give me all the information because I cannot take time for myself. I'm a bit of a nervous customer. I don't like to make people wait. So if I have to ask the store clerk, like, what products do you have? And she has to go through it with me. I like to take my time. I like to look at the shop window. I like to get in the information. That's a type of regulation that restricts my choices because it restricts the way that I buy products. So there's a multitude of those type of things. You have things that are banned outright. I mean, there's places in the world where, just a couple of months ago, I was in Thailand where having just a disposable e-cigarette can get you to prison, right?
Whoa. So
there's very restrictive rules on that too. So consumer choice, I think, again, I started with talking about the Soviet Union. We've gone, like, we're in a very positive situation compared to how it used to be in many countries. But the idea that we can make our choices completely freely, I also don't think we're there yet. So we have work left to do.
Yeah, okay. To move forward and to touch our main topic, harm reduction, could you explain what harm reduction means for consumers? And do you believe that risk-based regulations and the so-called prohibitionist approaches really is compatible with maintaining freedom of choice or not?
Right. We mention harm reduction a lot lately in the field of tobacco, but actually harm reduction is something we do all the time. If you get into a car and you drive and the first thing is you put your seatbelt on, which I hope people do, that's harm reduction. When you get on a motorcycle and you put your helmet on, that is harm reduction. The best way of avoiding being in a car accident is not driving a car. Right? That is the easiest way of not being in a car accident.
That is super safe.
Mega safe. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. Unless you cross the street. Let's say you never even use a street. Then you can never be in a car accident or involved in getting hit by a car. But of course, that's not realistic. That's not how we live our lives. We can't just close the door and just stay home and just think that nothing ever goes wrong. So we need to do certain things, and we want to do certain things. But there's easy ways to reduce the risks associated with our activity. And the seatbelt is just a brilliant example. The helmet is a good example of representing that. And with the use of nicotine, it is the same. So, I mean, I see when I'm here in Georgia, people smoke a lot. I mean, it's very common. Like people smoke a lot of cigarettes.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sorry for interruption, but unfortunately, Georgia's smoking rate is on top in European region. So.
And there's reasons for that. Sometimes it's a cultural reason. It used to be that the French were known for smoking the most amount of cigarettes just by virtue of also, I mean, it was represented in movies. There's cultural reasons. There's also stress levels in countries for reasons of economic development that makes that smoking rates are high. There's all sorts of reasons, but it doesn't have to be this way if people are offered all the alternatives. For the longest time, the alternative was just quit, just stop. If you went to a doctor, the doctor would say, oh, you can try these chewing gums, or just stop. But the problem is that for a lot of people that doesn't work. The approach of cold turkey, just stopping cigarettes, is not effective. And the chewing gums, they work for some people. I mean, it wouldn't have worked for me. So now the market has provided this alternative with heat not burn devices, e-cigarettes, nicotine pouches. And it actually solved the problem in the sense that there's smoking rates have gone down in a lot of countries that took it a bit easier on the regulation. But at the same time, people equate, in the prohibitionist side, they equate smoking and vaping. Because to them, it produces vapor, smoke, looks about the same, both have nicotine. Nicotine must be the problem. But I think this is important for people to know. The nicotine is not the problem. So when you smoke cigarettes, you have combustible tobacco and all the additives in it. That's the carcinogens. That's the problem. And I think this harm reduction approach it's what we do by putting the seatbelt on. It's what we do with clean needle exchange programs in drug policy. It's the reason why the Netherlands essentially tolerates cannabis, because in the 70s it was to give people an alternative to heroin. That was the idea. It's what we do for teenagers when we give them condoms, because we say, well, we know you're going to have sex, but at least harm reduction. So a lot of these things, like we know this and we apply this already, and governments that are bad on tobacco harm reduction often already use some type of harm reduction in other areas. It's just that there's some mental block for people on this one. And I think that's the problem that we experience.
Yeah, and regarding the consumption of addictive substances like tobacco, alcohol, or drugs, you mentioned the harm reduction approach and policies, but unfortunately, states are always and often implement these strict regulations against these kind of addiction substances. And can you compare these two kind of approach, and which is working better, and what is the reasons for that?
Right. I mean, we can go very extreme on the one side. I mentioned Thailand earlier, where you can go to prison. That was actually a French woman a couple of years ago. She was in jail for 3 days just for having a disposable e-cigarette. Sorry. And then you have a very open approach, which was practiced in the UK. And I mean, the UK might make some changes now. We'll see how that pans out. But the moment we're recording right now, the UK is a good example of how it helps to have the availability of e-cigarettes, to the extent that the National Health Service, the public health care provider in the UK, promotes vaping as an alternative. I think a good example also is Sweden. Sweden is essentially almost smoke-free. Smoke-free, I think if it's less than 5% of people that smoke, then it's considered smoke-free, and that's because of snus and nicotine pouches that people use. You rarely see people smoking cigarettes in Sweden, but it doesn't mean they don't use nicotine, because under the lip there might be a pouch. But of course, that is much safer than smoking conventional tobacco. So there's countries that have, sometimes by accident, and sometimes intentionally, reduced the harm from smoking in their societies. And there's countries that are very strict on it, and the differences are clear. I mean, in Sweden, the incidences of lung cancer are lower, and I think that's a real success there. And they've done it without trying to make cigarettes illegal. They didn't have to. It's like people just don't want to buy conventional cigarettes in those countries anymore. And I think that's a good thing, because look, if you said here in Georgia, we're going to make cigarettes 10 times more expensive, or we're just going to ban cigarettes, which one is more likely? Is that all of Georgia is going to decide tomorrow to stop smoking, or that there's going to be a neighboring country maybe, that's going to see an opportunity, and there's going to be cross-border smuggling, and people are going to start smoking even more because those cigarettes would be then cheaper on the black market. If you go to Paris and you enter at Paris Gare du Nord, the North train station, the first thing you see is somebody offering you counterfeit cigarettes. Because a pack of cigarettes is above 10 euros in France, but you can buy one for 3 or 4 euros on the black market. And I think we need to, public health policy is complicated. You can't just make people do a thing just because you passed a law. You need to be focused. You need to be careful about these things. Sweden and the UK are great examples of bringing smoking rates down. So I think, that's the way we should go.
Looking at the UK's experience, could you tell us what were the key ingredients that contributed to the reduction in smoking rates in the UK? So,
yeah, vaping is a key component. A lot of people want to pretend that the price also had an impact, but when they raised prices on cigarettes too quickly, what happened is that you had this development of a black market. The interesting thing in the UK is that it was not planned. It was not that there was some commission that got together with all the experts and they looked at the evidence. They didn't really regulate vaping when it came out as a product. And that was somewhat of a conscious choice that they didn't regulate it. And by the time politicians had the ideas of regulating it, we had enough data to understand what it did. And what it did was significantly reduce smoking rates because people had this alternative. And I think there will be a lot of listeners maybe who've never smoked a cigarette and who will not understand this. Nicotine consumption can be an addiction, but it's not that everyone who smokes cigarettes is like deadly addicted to them. Sometimes it's to improve your focus, to take the edge off after a day. I mean, it can be a lot of things that people use nicotine for. People with ADHD self-medicate with nicotine. That's also a factor. But I think sort of this habit of a cigarette, if you have it at a bus stop, these kind of things that they stick with you, and having a heat not burn or vape device, this is sort of like what gives people this alternative, while also having the feeling of nicotine and regulating the amount of nicotine better. Because now, I mean, I vape and I'm at 6 milligram. Eventually, I'll be at 3 milligrams of nicotine. That means you reduce your overall consumption of nicotine as well, while not having all the disadvantages of smoking cigarettes. So I think, yeah, the UK has been an excellent example of how to do it. But we'll see. They want to have more regulation now, and maybe they'll backtrack. But from what we know in the UK, it's just a fantastic example of how to do it.
Yeah, and you suggested harm reduction approach as an alternative of a paternalistic state, right? State that is focused on strict regulations. And can you tell us, does a paternalistic approach really means better health conditions and better rates, for example, in smoking rate or in alcohol usage or in drug policies or not?
It doesn't. And because every society that you introduce nicotine and alcohol to, they don't stop. If you had an isolated island in somewhere in the Pacific and they've never heard of nicotine and alcohol, and you went there and you said those are now illegal, they would be like, okay, I've never heard of it, it doesn't matter. But those societies that have them already, they don't stop. We like alcohol, and a lot of people like nicotine. So the question is how to do it properly. We've tried the strictest type of paternalism before. There was prohibition of alcohol. Prohibitionism in the United States created massive mafia groups.
Yeah.
Al Capone was a product of prohibition. Thousands of people died from the crime related to prohibition, but also to the effects of trying to make alcohol themselves with ethanol poisoning, very common. Cigarettes were also restricted. For half the population, women were not legally allowed to smoke cigarettes until the mid-20th century. There was a woman in New York in 1908. She was arrested for smoking cigarettes in public because the only women that smoked cigarettes were prostitutes. Prostitutes, and prostitution was illegal. So there was a lot of these social restrictions that were often based in religion. So religion was often the cause. It had nothing to do with public health. It was sort of public morality. And they said, you know, we're gonna have to ban this. And it was a complete disaster. I think the most interesting stat is alcohol consumption per capita increased during the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Because, and this is sort of in prohibition you have something called the potency effect. If you make alcohol illegal and you don't distinguish between the levels of how strong is the alcohol. If I go out and now I go to a dealer and I buy alcohol, I'm not going to buy beer.
Yeah.
I'm going to buy liquor.
Stronger, yeah.
Because if I get caught, I might as well get caught for something that was worth it, not for a six-pack of beer. So people started drinking less low alcohol drinks, and they drank more whiskey and gin. And that increased the overall consumption of alcohol. So this perverse effect is that the exact thing they were trying to achieve, which is make people healthier and the society more functioning, it made the society more unsafe and people less healthy. So prohibitionism, it really, really doesn't work.
Yeah, and so do you consider that risk-based regulations is inherently paternalistic, or you think that in some cases and in some spheres, regulations are necessary?
You need to have some level of public health control, for instance, for minors. Children should not have access to alcohol, and they should not have access to nicotine products. How to do that best, that's a regulatory question, because I think somebody in a shop that sells to a child, the cigarettes to a child, for instance, needs to lose their license to sell those products. There's a parental obligation to enforce that as well. So I think that's a public health rule that I think makes sense. Children shouldn't have access to those things. There's also rules for, product safety, which sounds a bit odd, because what kind of product safety should you have for cigarettes, for instance? But they're already unsafe. But it turns out if you look at black market products, there are cigarettes on the black market that will make you blind within a month. So, there's real concerns there. So I think that's also public health regulation that makes sense. But I think overall, a lot of what we're discussing now, whether it's banning the advertising of or the showing of products, whether it's reducing the alcohol input, whether it's not having access to, scratch lottery tickets or online poker or any of those things, overall they're paternalistic. And I think on a fundamental level, outside of the argument of this has bad consequences, I think it's also offensive to the individual. As an individual, I get to make those choices because I know the consequences of consuming alcohol. I know how much, I know after how many drinks I should stop. It's like will I make mistakes? Sure. But my mistakes are not indicative of how everyone else needs to be regulated and live their lives. That is not a good indicator. Most people drink alcohol responsibly. And it's like people forget about this. We only hear about the bad cases. Most people do it responsibly. And I think that should be the argument first. First argument with public health regulation is, I make those choices for myself. I'm an individual. I get to decide. Then we can talk about the bad influences of those policies. But the principle should be consumer choice.
So, as we already mentioned, Georgia decided to have strict regulations on these substances like alcohol, nicotine, and so on. But when we are talking about harm reduction principles, and we want to the society to have less harm, and consumers to be less harmful. So in literature and in academia, taxes are considered one of the main tools how you can deal with this topic. So, for example, in Georgia, we have tax policy on alcohol. That is, I think, a bit harm reduction is involved in this tax system because, for example, if you buy beer, which is less alcoholic, the tax is lower than, for example, spirits. And can you tell us and give us advice, give Georgia advice, how should tax policy must be or should be regarding the tobacco, for example? And is there the same correlation or not?
With any tax, and as your professional background, you will also know, a lot of countries have these specific rules on taxation that any new tax or any increase in tax needs to explain to the institutions what it actually achieves. If you start a tax, you need to explain, usually in most constitutional systems, what is it for? What is the money used for? Does it achieve the aims? A lot of these type of sin taxes don't really explain that because the tax is not to fund an educational program. Often it actually funds like renovating roads or whatever prestige project of a politician. And also they don't actually achieve the reduction in the consumption of the product that they want to have. Taxes on cigarettes are there to reduce the amount of cigarettes smoked. It tries to disincentivize people from smoking. But interestingly, at the same time, it makes the government a lot of money. So the government, it's the perverse effect, the perverse reality of cigarette taxes. The government actually needs the revenue, but it also wants people to stop smoking. That's a really complicated dilemma for a government to be in. But also, and I think I mentioned this already, there's a black market component there too. People can get cigarettes off the black market as well. And that means that whatever taxes you put on cigarettes or on any product is in competition, that price level is in competition with the black market. If the difference becomes too big, it becomes the market shifts towards the illicit market. Good example. A lot of consumers in Canada, like a lot of cannabis consumers in Canada, are still buying from their dealers, even though cannabis is legal. And the reason for that is because the government saw an opportunity to tax cannabis to generate revenue, and they taxed it so much that it became a quasi-prohibition for some people because it was too expensive, and they went back to the dealer. So prohibition is one thing. Prohibition is just saying everything's illegal. But you can have a sort of quasi-prohibition with taxes where people who make a lot of money, they don't care how expensive cigarettes are. Rich people can buy cigarettes as much as they want. Yeah. But a lot of people on the low income side, for them, cigarettes are too expensive. And they will make different decisions than to get their cigarettes. So it's a complicated equilibrium to see how much money do we need to fund education campaigns, public awareness campaigns. What's a reasonable amount compared to sort of where the black market is at? In any case, I would say this idea that you can solve the public consumption of cigarettes with taxation, it is not going to work. Because the utility that people get out of cigarettes is high. There's price elasticity that you need to take into account. Compare the price of a pack of cigarettes to the price of a pint of beer, and then ask a smoker how they compare. If a pack of cigarettes in the UK, for instance, gets you 2 pints of beer, most smokers will tell you they get more joy out of 1 pack of cigarettes than they could ever get from 2 beers. So I think this idea that if we just tax it very high, problem is going to go away. That's not how it works. You need to study it carefully, and as a government have impact assessments.
Okay, and we can go to the end of our podcast, and I want to ask you the last question. We are talking about state approach to strictly regulate these substances like alcohol or drugs or nicotine, and we know why what are the incentives, like, because very strict policies are always popular in general society, and it may also have so-called electoral incentives, right? And can you tell us the different perspective? How does consumers perceive these paternalistic policies that are in practice? Because we, the ordinary people, the consumers, are real executors of these policies.
Most people don't think about cigarette taxation when they vote in a general election of parliament, because that's not on the top of their mind. Even for smokers, by the way, even smokers don't really care about taxation of those products when they go vote. Usually there's more important issues. So when we polled, and I mean, this is something that's also available on our website, when we polled people in different markets, most consumers will always tell you that they don't like paternalism. They will say...
So you're talking about the survey, right?
Yeah, we've done surveys at Consumer Choice Center. When you ask people, they don't like the idea of being told what to do. Of course, with surveys, it's always like, how do you ask the question? All of that, statistics, the whole quotes, we know, we've all heard it. But there is also a subsection of consumers that want problems to be solved by the government. And they say, if only government did X, Y, Z, they could solve this problem. They often overstate how much the government is able to do and how much it is able to achieve. So you have this dichotomy. At the same time, people want, when they talk about themselves, it's like, yeah, I make my own choices. But some other people have problems and they need help from the government. Right? They need that regulation. It's never about themselves. It's always about other people. So consumer perception is sometimes complicated to assess. But I mean, nobody campaigns on this ever, and I think that's the biggest problem. Nobody in elections says, like, when you vote for me, I'm going to increase the prices of cigarettes. They always do that later. And then it sort of gets mushed in and it ends up as one of the side topics. Until it won't be. And I said this a couple of times already in other interviews. Sin, taxes, regulations on gambling, regulations on alcohol, when they get introduced, not too many people, like, nobody will protest for this. Like, nobody would say, like, oh, allow it and so on. Until it becomes so much that people say, okay, too much has happened at the same time, leave us alone. And that's sort of what you had with the yellow vests protest in France, where people said, life's too expensive, everyone tells us what to do, there's taxes on everything, can't stand it anymore. They put on the yellow vest and they protested. And when you try to read the newspapers and find out what did they protest against, it was a bit complicated because they also didn't know. Because it was so many issues at the same time that had accumulated that it became difficult for them to understand what had happened. And to me, restrictions on all of these lifestyle choices are the same. Individually, this specific law, this specific regulation, people don't pay enough attention. But there is a point where it accumulates so much that people have a general sense of anger that they cannot really explain. And as a politician, if I was looking at this as a politician, I would fear that this could happen any moment to me. So I would always think of public health policy as something that I need to be careful with. That would be sort of my conclusion, whatever you want to call it.
And I will add a very, very short opinion about your last remark, that when people are protesting something and they didn't know what they are protesting very well, maybe it is very how to say, problematic, because, for example, in Georgia, you also saw that our people is protesting against the so-called Russian law, right? And the government media is asking people, what are you protesting? And some of them really are there just because they don't like the government. So I think it is a way problematic, and it needs a more attention, that people are protesting because all of your regulations and governing issues. And then, for example, if you consider someone who is protesting something special, and someone is protesting but don't know specifically what is the matter of protest, it is it's way dangerous than this.
It can be. I mean, I can't speak to the specifics of the Georgian law, right, because that's not my field of expertise. But what I can say is that we make a difference between politics and policy.
Yeah.
And policy is, trying to find the nitty-gritty of how to make a law and what changes to make. Politics is also about policy, but politics is also feeling. And politics, sometimes to people, they protest because they feel that they're not heard. They feel that they don't trust the people in charge. And for that feeling, you don't need to know everything. And that goes both ways. That doesn't mean that the person protesting is correct, but they're expressing a feeling. And as a politician that tries to stay in power, you need both. You need to have the policy that works for people, but you also need to transmit a feeling that they can trust you. And if you only have one, you lose. So I think any protest is an expression of that, whether it's the Israel-Gaza protests that are happening, whether it's over the war in Ukraine, whether it's the elections now in the European Union, whether it's purchasing power. It's both policy and it's feeling. And I think that is important to realize. So if somebody gets interviewed at the protest and doesn't know exactly the policy, that says something about them, yes, but it's still important to know where they come from and what made them take to the streets.
So thank you very much, Bill. It was very interesting for me, and I think, and I'm sure for our audience. And so thank you very much.
Madloba.
Okay. Have a nice weekend in Georgia, and see you again in our channel.